as someone with a background in classical music and singer-songwriter vocal music styles, when did you begin exploring and taking a more experimental approach to the voice, and how did that language develop? I mean, did it happen alongside your switch from guitar to the Ibanez digital delay system that you started using after college?
Um, I would say that there was a very particular point in my life where all of these things started to change, and it was in the early 80s. And it definitely coincided with my beginning to use various technology. I think the first sort of thing that influenced me in that direction was that I was doing radio at the local public radio state NPR affiliate in Boulder, Colorado, where I went to school. I was doing a radio program on KGNU, and I just got really interested in all the experimental music that was in the stacks at that radio station, and I was doing this weekly program called the Tuesday Afternoon Sound Alternative. And I was just combining all kinds of different music that was from experimental genres across the spectrum. So it was like, experimental classical people, experimental folk, like kind of avant folk, people that were sort of more in the punk rock realm, and people in the sort of David Byrne, Brian Eno realm, and so I was playing all of these interesting things on my show, and I just became aware that the music that I was performing, because at that time I was making my living as a musician, and the music that I was performing didn't really have any relationship with the music that I was listening to. And so I decided I really wanted to try to make my own work more experimental. And I started trying to write pieces that were more avant-garde, more experimental, more adventurous. But I had a hard time figuring it out because everything I did was just sort of being influenced by the fact that I was using the same tools that I had been using to do other things. And so as long as I was still like just playing guitar and singing, it just started to be more like just kind of quirkier songs. And so it was at the moment where I introduced other technology. I started playing with tape recorders, and I started playing with digital delays, that I really feel like that's the time when I sort of found my voice as an artist. Because I immediately started listening different. I started thinking about layering voice. I started thinking about the interesting sounds that are inherent in speech sound. I started putting different timbres and textures against each other, because it was possible to do that, because I could make layers instead of just having one monophonic vocal source. And so so that's kind of the timing. Now I can't remember now if I've actually remembered your entire question, but I think that's what you were asking.
Yeah, it was really about this shift in the way that you're using the voice, or how your vocabulary may have developed as a singer. Is it totally as a result of the new technology that you were
Yeah, I
using?
do think it was because when I started experimenting with singing against myself and making various sounds and using speech sounds and do all of these things and being able to layer and loop them in real time, that sort of opened up, I think, a door for me in terms of just thinking about different ways to use the voice.
So along these lines, in 1998, you wrote the article "A Tool is a Tool," which covers a lot of ground, such as like how you incorporated new equipment into your work and how that led you to develop as an artist. So it's kind of along the lines of the first question. And in many or all cases, you talked about how using new technology led you to experience some happy accidents where you were, shooting for one goal and maybe ended up discovering something. I'm wondering if you could take us through your process of incorporating new tools into your practice, like the Body Synth and other gesture-based sensors and other tools that you've acquired over the years, since obviously you've been updating your tools and software regularly over the last 20 plus years. So I'm wondering if you have certain goals or ideas you're working toward, or if your initial usage with something new, a new piece of technology, is just to play and improvise freely.
Well, I think that playing and improvising freely is the process that I use to come up with the ideas that I have. But then they end up being solidified into pieces that are generally set, composed pieces. But I think you had like a couple questions layered in there, and so I'm not sure which one to start with, because so taking you through the process of introducing a new tool, I can give you a couple of examples of new tools that I started using, and then the happy accidents that occurred from using those, and that contributed greatly to the development of my work. And one of those is, so when I first started using digital delays, they were called digital delays because the recording that they make is actually digital. But in those days, all the controls on these things were analog, and everything, and so it didn't have the same kind of precision that now, when I make delay lines in my computer, I can say, I want this to be 1500 milliseconds or 1000 milliseconds or 4000 milliseconds, whatever I choose, it will be precisely that. But in those days, I would have these little analog knobs, and you would click it to 1000 milliseconds, and it would be 1000 milliseconds, give or take. So sometimes the tempo would be a little slower, and on another day it would be, because those things drifted, and they didn't have the same kind of precision that the tools have now. And so one of the interesting things that happened was, the first time I got a second delay, and these were just rack mountable, like 19-inch wide digital delay units. And I bought a second one. And the first thing I tried to do was to try to make the two delays be set at the same time, because I thought it would be interesting to have like me making loops in one and making loops in another one, and have them in sync with each other. And so I sat there and tried to adjust that little knob to get them to be together. And there was no, like at that time, there wasn't even MIDI that you could you couldn't hook one delay unit to the other delay unit and have one be like a clock that was slave to the other clock. They were just these two independent devices. So I started trying to adjust them to get them together, and I thought I had them pretty close. And so then I sang and I created a loop, and then the loops would very slowly begin to drift apart. So then I would sit there and again try to adjust it to get them together. And I must have done that for hours, like trying to get them together, until I just stopped and started listening. And I realized, oh my God, the sound of those loops going in and out of phase with each other was so much more beautiful than what I was trying to do, which was a very boring thing, and really from that point on, this idea of out of phase loops was introduced into my composition. And these days, like almost everything I compose uses that. And, when it happened, the first time it happened, it was a mistake. And I was so excited when I figured out that it was a great sounding thing. I thought I had invented the thing. And then I realized that like Steve Reich had done this 20 years before with tape loops, but I just couldn't be more delighted than I was with the sound of these loops going in and out of phase with each other. And to this day, and now it's funny because in those days I had all these different delay units stacked up in my rack, and all I had to do was try to set them, 3 of them, to the same time, and I would end up with these beautiful out of phase loops. Now because I do it all in the computer, I have to go in and deliberately say, this loop is 1000 milliseconds. This one is, 950 and this one is 1100. I have to like deliberately make them slightly different so that it will do that. Otherwise, they'll just be right in time with each other. But that's just one, example of that, of a happy accident causing that. Another similar thing was when I first started using video in my work. So I had been making a lot of performance works that involved my voice and electronics live. And then if I wanted a visual element, I would hire or collaborate with a video artist or a visual artist and have them make the visual part for what I was doing. Well, I had an artist residency at a place where I built like an installation in my studio that was made from these sheets of metal flashing, like steel flashing, that were hung with like binder clips. And then I had put piezo microphones on them and was capturing the sound of them moving. And I was singing into them and pushing them and moving them and just letting them be moved by the air currents in the room. When it came time to leave that residency, I really wanted to document that work. So I borrowed a video camera, and this was back in the days when, this was like a super high-end video camera, but it was like back in the day when I think the images were still 3x4. They didn't have those little memory cards yet in cameras. I think you had to this camera used like mini DV tape. But I didn't own a camera yet at that point and didn't really know how to do video. And so I borrowed this camera from the residency place. And then I started trying to document my work. And I was shooting all of this video that I thought was kind of artistically shot of close-ups and further away of these hanging strips of metal, and even like put videos of me manipulating it and so on. And as I did this, because I didn't have experience with video, I was treating that camera like you would treat a still camera. And so I was like, some shots, I was like, oh, this would be a nice, more of a portrait. And so I kept turning the camera. And so it wasn't until I sat down and tried to edit the video that I realized what I had done. And like half my footage was sideways. And then I was like, oh no. And also this way predates like, iPhones. And now, now it's kind of normal to shoot tall video sometimes, but in those days, nobody shot video except wide. It was only shot wide. And so now I had all this footage and half of it was sideways. And so I started thinking about it. And then I was like, I could make an interesting video installation, like a 2-channel video installation, where one of the monitors was normal and the other one was turned on its side. And so I edited all of the sideways footage together to make one channel. And I edited all of the normal, like sort of landscape version and made a second channel. And then I borrowed 2 displays from the place where I was doing my residency. And also this predates all these flat displays that are so ubiquitous now. So the displays in those days were like these big CRT monitors that were as thick as they are wide, and so I got these 2 great big CRT monitors, and I took one of them and turned it on its side and strapped it down with that nylon, strapping, and cinched it down so that it wouldn't fall over onto this AV cart. And then the other one was sitting in its normal position. And I showed this as sort of at the end of my residency, I showed this 2-channel piece that I had made. But after that, I started doing all kinds of video, and I started also playing with video in weird orientations and not, and making videos that were intentionally sideways. Of course, like several years later, when all of the iPhones and all of that came about, other people started doing things with tall video, but tall video was not a thing. And I feel like it was sort of like another like sort of discovery that I made because of a happy accident of something of like me not knowing what I was doing. Also, after doing that, I got really excited about making my own video, and I started including a lot of video in my performance works, and I started, shooting and editing and creating my own video. So that was something that like inserted itself into my work because of, this experience with trying to document something and ending up coming up with something that was more creative than just documentation. I've forgotten what your other question was. There was more.
I'd like to piggyback off the video thing if we can before we circle back to that. And I'm curious, do you still use hardware to film things currently, or are you mostly working in a digital medium to create the video content for your
Now,
works?
when you say to film, do you mean, do I still use cameras?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, almost all of the video content in my work is made in camera, and then it gets edited and sometimes treated in various ways, but it's mostly, and it's interesting because I do think there's a parallel between that and also how I like to work with sound, because a lot of the sound that I like to use is sound from real sounding sources. In other words, I don't use synthesis either. All of my sounds tend to be sampled actual physical things. And it might be speech sounds of people talking or people singing, but it's also like sounds of just like dropping things on the floor and recording the sound that they make, or recording water that I'm splashing in my sink or whatever. But it's like, it's almost like a musique concrète in a way of like the real actual sounds that I'm using as the ingredients. And I think I work with video the same way, and I do a processing on those things sometimes, or cut them up and distort them in ways that they might become unrecognizable. But usually fragments of what they were remain and are audible. And the same thing is true with the video that I use. It's usually video of things, more often than something that is just like generated, video, like digitally generated video information. I don't tend to use that. And that's not, it's not like it's not like that's a choice because I think that's a superior way to work or something like that. It's just, that's the way I work. And I know a lot of other people who make video work, and their video work is completely abstract and completely just made from things that they manipulate digitally, and they make beautiful work like that. But that's just not the way that I work. It's not my skill set, I guess.
I think you answered the previous question totally fully. I'm wondering if I guess when you work a lot with gesture and with the body synth, I guess I'm wondering.
I don't work with the body synth at all anymore. The body synth, I should just say, the body synth was the first gesture controller that I owned, and I started using it, I think, in 1992 or something. But I use gesture controllers a lot in my work, but they're all different ones now. I haven't used that one in a very long time.
Got it. So I guess I'm wondering how the technology has evolved and how that affected your use of gesture in your work.
Okay, so yeah, well, all of these gesture controllers are sensor based. So they're all basically, and oftentimes they're taking from other fields. Like a lot of them come from medical fields. Like the body synth was made with what do you call them? Electrode sensors, like the kind that they use in the hospital when they take your EKG or your EEG. And they're measuring the electrical impulses from the muscles, from that are generated from your nervous system. So that's one kind of sensor. But I have now, these days, there are 3 gesture controllers that I'm typically using, and one of them uses ultrasound, which is another thing that kind of comes from medical technology. So that one's looking for mass. And then I have one that uses infrared light. And then I have a wearable one that I use that's probably most similar to the Body Synth in that it's wireless and it's wearable, and I can walk around anywhere I want and use it. And that one has 3 different kinds of sensors in it: gyro, accelerometer, and electromagnetometer. And so all those different sensors are looking for, either like I'm using my gestures to create mass, which the one that uses the ultrasound is looking for mass, or it might be that it's sensing the proximity of my hands based on how quickly the light bounces back onto it, and different things like that. So they're all the gestures are all basically triggering something in these sensors. And then the sensors are creating numbers, which I send to the computer, and then I make decisions in my software as to what those numbers are controlling, which is something different in each piece, but now I can't remember what you asked me about. I think I digressed. But you were saying, how's it developed, or how's it?
Well, just I'm curious how the different gesture controls have affected the process of you creating new work, or how it's affected your sense of movement in your work or gesture.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, yeah. So all of these things are essentially biofeedback devices. And the one that I started with, the Body Synth, was, kind of a quintessential biofeedback device, because it's measuring the electricity from your muscles. And so using these devices has absolutely influenced my physical interaction with them and the quality of my actual movement, because of what's required to play them. And so, another story that I tell people a lot is when I first started using a gesture controller, this was the Body Synth back in the early 90s. I practiced a lot in my studio until I thought I had gotten really brilliant at it. And I was like, I was triggering sampled sounds. I was doing things where I was triggering a sound with one hand and then bending the pitch with the other. I was using sensors that were on my shoulder and on my arm to whip the sound around the room, so that if I had like a quadraphonic system, I could pan it so that it would go around the heads of the audience by doing these gestures and so forth. And I had done all these things, and I was like really practicing a lot in my studio, because I was getting ready for a big performance, which would be my sort of debut using these things. And so then when I got in front of an audience, it all just started like triggering like mad, and it was not doing at all what I wanted it to do. I was like, why is it triggering? I'm not doing anything. And then I realized basically it's measuring the electricity that is coming from my muscles. And so when you get in front of an audience, your adrenaline level bumps up, and that changes the whole, chemistry of what's happening with your adrenaline, and the electricity in your body. And so I had to learn how to like tamp down these, at first, luckily that instrument had these little thumb wheels that were on this unit that I wore on my waist, that I could adjust the threshold or the sensitivity. And so I had to turn it like way, way, way down, so that that thing was so sensitive that I could trigger a sample by just thinking about moving my hand, if I had the sensitivity turned all the way up. And so, because when you think about moving your hand, what happens? Your brain sends an electrical impulse to that muscle to tell it to prepare to move. And that was enough to trigger it. So at first I had to put the sensitivity way down, but then over time I learned to be really still in my body. And when I say still, I don't mean no motion, but what I mean is that I had to be able to, let's say I wanted to reach up here and trigger the sound of a bell ringing. I didn't want it to trigger while I was putting my hand up. I wanted to be able to put my hand up and have that muscle be so calm as I do that then I can come here and then ring the bell. And so that was just a matter of learning to be really still in my body. And that's like a quality of your movement. It's like, you know, if you make a big gesture with a muscle, then you're making big numbers for your MIDI controller, right? And if you make little tiny sensitive gestures, then you're making smaller numbers. But there's a way to learn how to have that calmness. So I can raise this arm, and I'm using these muscles to raise the arm, but I'm keeping these ones calm until I'm ready to use them. And so it was that kind of learning that caused me to be able to play these instruments with much more subtlety, and get like other things besides 0 or 127. You know, it's like just to be able to get the gradual, all those numbers in between. I had to learn, for example, I was doing a lot of gestures that were very, you know, big, flat hand, or make a fist, or, you know, things like that. And I had to learn that I could get a lot more subtlety by just using the fingers, or just use a little bit of the wrist, or, you know. And so it was just like learning to play. To me, it was just like learning to play an acoustic instrument, that you learn the gestures that you have to do in order to get the result from that instrument that you're trying to get. And in so in learning to do that, I without even trying, I basically trained my body, and it changed the quality of my physical movement. So if I look at old videos of myself when I was, before I had started using gesture controllers, because I liked doing gestures. As soon as I put down that guitar in the 80s and just started using my voice and electronics, I immediately added gestures to my work. And a lot of the pieces that I wrote had gestures in them that I think were so much a part of the piece that if I were to notate those, I would need to put a staff in for the gestures. But if I look at those old videos of myself versus videos after just a few years of working with these gesture controllers, the quality of my movement is completely different. In those old videos, my movement seemed really kind of stiff and, you know, dated and kind of, you know, and then when I look at later videos of my gestures, they seem much more nuanced and you know, and just elegant. And a lot of people will ask me, "Oh, did you study Indian dance to learn how to do those kind of gestures?" Or, and I'm like, "No, I just learned to play these instruments, and that's trained me to have a different quality of movement." So, so that's kind of I think that using those instruments had a pretty profound, maybe a more profound effect on just my visual presentation, my visual performance. Maybe the changes in that were at least as profound, if not more profound, than the sonic changes that came about from using these instruments.
When you started using those gesture controllers, was it because you found yourself incorporating more movement into your work, or did you say like, here's a cool toy, I'm going to experiment and play with it and see what I can create, and then I'll make a work out of it? Or
well, I think what I was already using some gestures in my work and thinking about the physical presence as being an important part of the work. But I think, oh, the other thing is, I had just started using samples, like, you know, I mean, I had, you know, from very early on, like from the mid 80s, I was using delays to do live sampling of my voice. But at a certain point towards the late 80s, I started incorporating sampled sounds that I had recorded and created banks of samples. And the only way to trigger those in performance was to have some kind of MIDI controller. So the most obvious one would be like a keyboard. And I'm not a piano player, and I don't really particularly want to be carrying a big keyboard around with me. But I think I did a few performances where I actually brought a MIDI keyboard with me because I wanted to play samples as part of the piece I was performing live. And so right around that time was also the time that I discovered the the Body Synth, and it was a way for me to be able to play sampled sounds without having to have a keyboard. Instead, I could use, and I was already really interested in having my hands free and gesturing. And so it was a way that I could use those gestures to actually play the sounds I was wanting to play. So it kind of had a confluence of, situations, so that the fact that I came in contact with these guys who make this instrument, and I started playing with it, and I was like, wait a second, if I had this, I wouldn't have to carry a MIDI keyboard with me. I could just use my body as the MIDI keyboard. So that was kind of the main impetus for me to use that. But then I think it grew from there to, there is a certain quality that you get when you're using a controller that allows you to use your human physicality to play the instrument, rather than just turning a knob or pushing a button, so I think that also became an important thing for me, is that I could get there would be a very nuanced way of creating a set of sample, like I had these pieces I used to do where I had sampled. Most of my samples in those days, and also even today, are not sampled conventional instrument sounds. They're mostly samples of other things, like objects, found objects, or samples of speech sounds, or samples of whatever, other, I don't tend to like use a bunch of sample banks, library of sampled instruments, other than the voice, which is a sampled instrument. But I mean, other than that, I tend not to use sampled instruments, but in a few pieces I do. And I had one piece I used to do where I had it was a Steinway piano sample. And I was playing the piano with these little finger gestures. And what I found was that I could get much more interesting, very quick sample, piano playing with using physical gestures, much better than I could do if I was just trying to play those sounds on a piano keyboard, because my movements on the piano keyboard would conform to my knowledge of how to play the piano, and which is not that great. And, it's like, but somehow with these physical gestures, I could do a lot of really quick little finger movements and play these piano samples, and create kind of a barrage of piano sound that's not at all like what I would get if I was trying to actually accurately hit that many notes on the keyboard with my hand, so there are a lot of differences in the way that those samples can be played if they're using physical gestures rather than playing it through a MIDI enabled other instrument. So yeah, I don't remember what question I'm answering, but
This is great. It made me think like you're kind of sculpting sound in a way that it wouldn't be realistic to create it that way, but that's really interesting. That's the only thing I can think of, is like you're sculpting it in the moment. So because we're talking about movement, I wanted to jump to talk about your studies in Japan. And what led you to study, is it Buto? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, Buto is correct.
Buto, and Japanese.
A Japanese language?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that what led to me studying, my interest in Japanese language just came from the fact that I love language, and I just am really attracted to it. And there was a point in time, I don't know, pretty long time ago, I would say starting in like maybe the late 70s, early 80s, where I became enamored of Japanese, just Japanese aesthetics. And I loved like the sort of clean, minimal lines of like just the furnishings and the way that, so I love the way, I think I noticed those visual things first, but I also became really interested in the language. And I actually started studying Japanese years before I went to Japan or even knew I would go. I just was like, I just find it interesting. I want to learn it. So I also loved, like, I loved the idea of like the Japanese phonetic alphabets and how beautiful and kind of simple and clear that is, that there's this really finite number of sounds in that language, and they can all be codified in this, small alphabet of symbols, so that was interesting to me before I even thought about like putting it into my work. It was more just an interest of mine. And then kind of maybe separately from that, I later, like after having moved to the Bay Area and in the I guess probably in the maybe late 80s, probably, or early 90s, maybe. It's probably early 90s that I just I became, I started collaborating actually with, this is right now, I'm only just remembering this as I tell you this, but so I had this group called the Qube Chix that I know that you know about because you have I know you're going to ask me a question about them, but the Qube Chix were three of us. There were me, an opera singer named Julie Queen, and a Butoh dancer named Lee Evans. And I learned about Butoh from Lee. And in one of our early sort of experimental theater pieces, Lee choreographed a whole bunch of like Butoh physicality on stage that is part of this piece. And I think she was my first exposure to it. And then from learning it from her, I then became interested in all these other practitioners of Butoh, and I started going to see. There was a Butoh company in San Francisco. It was an elderly Japanese couple that had a company, and a lot of people, Lee had been in their company, and a lot of other people had been in their company. And then there was, this internationally touring company, Sankaijuku, from Japan, that very well known. They came through and I went and saw them. And so eventually a lot of these things coalesced because I became interested in Butoh through Lee and then through my other friends who did Butoh. And then I eventually got to go to Japan, and I went twice. First, I went on a tour just with three other experimental music composers, and we did this 5-city tour on this festival called the Interlink Festival. But then I went back in 99, and in the meantime, I had learned about Sankaijuku. I had learned about all these other Butoh people. I had learned about the very famous Butoh master Kazuo Ono, who was still alive at that time. And I found out that you could actually go to his studio and study with him. So I was going once a week to Yokohama and studying, being in these Butoh classes with a bunch of other dancers. It was mostly dancers that would go. It was dancers and a few odd people like me that would show up and sort of learn Butoh. But yeah, so that's kind of where that came from. And then when I got back from Japan, I made a piece called Gaijin, which was a full evening performance work. And I had done a couple of these large scale performance works before, but they had been solo. And this is the first one that I did where I involved other performers. And except for the Qube Chix stuff, which we did as a group, but the things where I was basically the driving force behind it, and then I brought in other performers, this was the first time I did that. And it was called Gaijin, and I wanted it to be for myself and 3 Butoh dancers. And so I had the privilege of knowing who I think were like 3 of the best Butoh dancers in the Bay Area. And they were Lee Evans, who was this person who was in the Qube Chix, and a guy called Shinichi Yovakoga, who's an amazing experimental theater and dance artist. And then a guy called Kinji Hayashi, Kinji is no longer with us, sadly, but those 3 were like the power Butoh trio to have. And I asked them all if they'd be in my piece, and they all said yes. So that was, a very exciting thing. but yeah.
So aside from you incorporating it into one of your pieces, how did the experience of, being immersed in that culture and going to study Buto in Japan contribute to your artistic practice?
Well, I think everything that you study and that you pay attention to finds its way into your work in some way. And so I don't know if I can name a lot anything direct other than, like, say, that piece, for example, and also a few other pieces where I've actually just put Japanese language into the piece, just because I love language and that's, something I do. But I do think that in a lot of ways that I probably can't define, that whole experience certainly impacted me. And also, I think, just as I was saying, playing the gesture control instruments had an influence on the quality of my movement in my performance. I'm also certain that taking a little bit of Buto, and also I took some a couple of classes as well while I was there. I wasn't as interested in that as something, but I was really interested in Buto because I knew I was going to make this work and include Buto dancers in it. But the was also still interesting. And also there were things about the way that you walk in theater that were sort of contributing to a real awareness of just comportment on stage. I don't know. So I think it had an interesting influence in the way that it's just that it changes you. So when something changes you, then it changes your work, so yeah.
Can we talk about the Qube Chix a little bit?
Sure.
How did this project start? I mean, what was your collaborative process like?
Well, there was a very, very specific story behind how we started. And that was that there used to be this avant-garde theater group in San Francisco called Soon 3. And they would do these big performance art projects that were like kind of sculptural, architectural sets that had all kinds of moving parts. And with interesting music and movement on stage by actors with like really strange minimal scripts. And anyway, they were making a piece in, I don't know, I think that probably it was 91 or something, because the Qube Chix started in 92. So I think that it was probably 90 or 91. They were making a piece called Ace Taboo, and they wanted a performer. They knew they wanted a female performer who could sing and could move, and they had held auditions. Lee and Julie and I did not know each other, and they auditioned the three of us, and they auditioned us by bringing us to the director's home. And then they just directed us in a bunch of actions, and they asked us to move through their house. And they watched us. They think they maybe filmed us moving through their house, and they told us different things to do. And so all three of us were there, and sometimes they would have us do things one at a time. Sometimes they asked us to do things together, but they were looking for one person. When they got done with the audition, they told us they would call us the next day and tell us who got it. And it was down to the three of us. They couldn't make up their minds, so they hired all three of us. And so all three of us were in this company. And in this show, the set for this show was a bunch of big red cubes. And so when the show opens, this gigantic, like 9-foot square red cube drives itself out on, like, just wheels out on its own power onto the stage. And then out of the front lower panel, center lower panel pops open, and 3-foot square cubes come shooting out of the mouth of this big red cube. And those red cubes each had one of us in them. That's how the show started. So the show started with this gigantic red cube wheeling itself out onto the stage. And then a panel opens and these 3 little red cubes shoot out. and we're inside and we're driving these things. Like, I think they were like lifted slightly off the ground with like little wheel type mechanisms. And we're just like inside driving them. So it looks like these little cubes are just going around on the stage. And then at some point, the lids pop open and the three of us pop out of these cubes and we're singing in ancient Sumerian. It was the strangest piece. But anyway, we did this show and it had, you know, weeks and weeks and weeks of rehearsal. And then I don't know, a 2-week run or something at this theater in San Francisco. And the guys in the, like all the tech crew started referring to us as the Qube Chix. They were like, somebody get the Qube Chix from their dressing, get the Qube Chix on stage, you know, blah, blah, blah. They were like calling us the Qube Chix because we made our entrance in these cubes. And so then when the show ended, we all loved working together. And we were like, so sad because we're like, we don't want to not work together anymore. We're going to miss each other. And so I went home and literally, I think the next night, I stayed up all night and wrote our first song. And then I called the other two and I said, we have to have a band and the band's going to be called the Qube Chix. And I've written our first song already. And so we formed a group and we called ourselves the Qube Chix. That's how we started.
And were you the primary like composer for the group?
I was the primary composer and Lee was the primary choreographer, because our band, it was a really weird band because we were kind of like, we couldn't figure out if we were like a punk rock like girl group or, you know, like the Slits or something, or if we were like an experimental theater group. And so we started making all these pieces that were there were songs, like we had this one song that was just us like screaming bel canto opera style at the top of our lungs with a drum machine. That was one of our songs. And then we had another song where eventually we got a drummer and a bass player. And so we had, you know, so we had these songs that we could play like in clubs. But then we also were like making these experimental theater performance works where we were having like Buto movement and I was composing music and we were bringing in like a sort of a little chamber ensemble that would, you know, I would write parts for them and I write harmonies for us to sing. And it was, it was some weird combination of like Sankai Juku meets Bertolt Brecht or something. I don't know. It was like so weird. It was like we had these weird, like kind of almost like you know, sort of like Kurt Weill-esque songs, and then like these weird kind of experimental, you know, atonal things. And so it was very hard to define what we were.
And whose idea was it to shave people's heads?
Oh, well,
I had to ask.
Well, you must have watched the Bald Boyfriend video.
I definitely watched it several times. It's so great.
You know, well, so Lee was a Buto dancer, and at that time, all the Buto dancers were bald. They were hairless. Like all Buto dancers shaved every hair on their bodies. So, so Lee was always bald in the early days, and then I had a mohawk, and then Julie had just like spiky blonde, bleach blonde hair. But I guess so I wrote this song called Bald Boyfriend. And I wrote the song because I had a huge crush on the actor who was in that theater piece with us that we were in. But he was gay. He was one of my many gay boyfriends that was never a boyfriend because he was gay. But anyway, and so essentially he was not available. He was not an item, but he was this kind of very handsome bald guy. And so I wrote this song, Bald Boyfriend. And so then we learned the song and we decided that it was important that every time we perform the song that we shave a guy's head. So that's where that idea came from.
When you were writing for the Qube Chix, when you came to rehearsal, was a lot of the pieces fixed at that point, or did you get together and experiment and improvise together and sort of shape the works into what they ended
Well,
up
it was a
being?
combination. On the songs, I tended to write them whole cloth, like, and then I would come and we'd learn them. Although the other two definitely contributed nuances to how things that were in the songs, and ways they were sung. Like, for example, with Bald Boyfriend, there's this whole bunch of vocalizing that we do in the middle of it. And a lot of that came from Lee's vocalizing, and all of us sort of vocalizing together. So there was like improvisational things we would do vocally together that would solidify into being parts of the structure of the works. But so for the songs, like the songs that we played in clubs, those were mostly like I would actually write the songs. And actually Lee wrote one of them too. And she and I helped her figure out. I think she actually played it on my guitar, and then I wrote a harp part, and I had a harpist play the part that she used to play on her guitar, and then she started playing an accordion. So anyway, there were all kinds of weird little developments like that. But then for the more like theatrical pieces, those would come from, I would do a lot of composing of the music on my own, but also we would sort of improvise together and find things for those. And then we would figure out how to put all that stuff together. So it was a process. And then Julie, who is the one who I said was the opera singer, she was also an acrobat. Like she used to do this before she became a Qube chick. And before she was in that theater piece that we were all in together, she used to do this act where she would sing opera arias like from a flying trapeze. She'd be like hanging by her knees and singing, the aria from what is it? Okay, I'm drawing a complete blank, but it's the one with the high season, the
Queen of the Night.
Queen of the Night aria. She would sing the Queen of the Night aria hanging by her knees from a trapeze way up high in the and so she would do these things. Like she had another aria that she had a bird cage, and she would like be locked in this bird cage, and she would sing she was doing like these crazy antics with like opera arias and bizarre like acrobatics. But anyway, so she had a lot of ideas about sort of physical theater stuff, and kind of also just ideas about like what the libretto should be. And and so we all contributed in different ways to the work.
I know we're running a bit low on time, but I wanted to ask you about your first album, Echolocation, recently re-released, and how your compositional process has changed since the original release.
Well, that record, a lot of the songs on that record were made when it was still first just had started using digital delays. And so it was kind of a new process for me of these looping songs. And so I feel like in a way, it's like that is a deep kernel in what I still do today. And a lot of what I'm doing today is really coming directly out of that work. But I think I just expanded, I think it was like, I don't even know if I had started doing the out of phase loops yet. Oh yes, I had, because I had Pop Titles U was on that record, and Pop Titles U involved 3 digital delays lines that were slightly different tempi. As a matter of fact, it was like one of the earliest ones that I made that was like that. But so those were the early days of that. I think I started using much longer delays after I made that record. And so I was making things that were more ambient and more kind of, I don't know, bigger, more abstract kind of things. I think that I think a lot. I mean, there are a couple of things on that record that I still perform today. So there's a definite through line from that period to where I am now. But and also I would say that that was definitely predates my like composing for chamber ensembles and stuff like that. I hadn't done any of that yet when I made that record. And nowadays I'm making a lot of work where I compose either for chamber ensembles with electronics or with some kind of a tape part or whatever, or chamber ensembles combined with my voice and electronics. So that's kind of something that's different from what I was doing then. I also would say that the way that I work with sampled speech sounds has really developed a lot since then. So I was using text already, like again, Pop Titles U is on there. So like it's to this day, it's probably still my favorite found text piece of mine. But I hadn't started doing the thing yet of sampling people's speech sounds and then cutting it up and building music out of that. So that's a pretty major part of what I do that had yet to develop when I had made that record.
This is also before the gesture sensors as well, right?
Oh yeah, I didn't have gesture controllers when I made Echolocation. I made Echolocation in mid 80s or mid to late, I think 88, maybe late 80s. I didn't have my first gesture controller until 92. So
I listened to that album again. I love that album, but I listened to it again very recently, side by side with The Secret Code, which was very interesting to listen to those.
Well, that right there, that kind of gives you a story right there, doesn't it? Of like the difference between sort of the quality of what kinds of things I was doing. That there's definitely a connection, and yet there's some big differences. Yeah. So how was that experience for you, hearing those two?
I loved it, actually. I really like I understand the quality of the recording from the 80s, but I still very much loved it, and I think that it adds very much. In fact, I bought it on vinyl.
Oh yay, yeah.
So
I was so thrilled when those guys said that they only wanted to issue it on vinyl. I mean, you can buy it digitally, you can download it, but you can't buy a CD of it. You used to be able to buy a cassette of it. But there aren't many of those still in existence. So
hey, they're making a comeback though.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can we just quickly ask who and what are currently your major influences and what you're working on now?
Okay. So which should I answer first? I guess I'll talk about influences briefly. I think it's, I feel like it's always hard to just start rattling off the names of people to think about influences, but I have kind of like a smattering, the kinds of people that have influenced me over the years, and who I feel like just the type of work that they do still influences me, are people like, of course, John Cage, Pina Bausch, Robert Wilson. I don't know. Are you familiar with Robert Wilson's work, theater direction, like, and his work with, and like, particularly early on, his work with Philip Glass, but also other works that he's done with other people since then. Kazuo Ono, I'll mention, that Buto dancer that he lived to be 100 years old, but then I think he was 101 or something when he died. But Janet Cardiff, sound artist who does amazing things with binaural sound. I don't know, Robert Ashley and his work with voices and his sort of very unusual take on opera. Yoko Ono, William Kentridge. I don't know. There's just a big span of people. But the other thing I will say is that my influences come not just from composers or musicians or even performing artists, but a lot of my influences come from visual art and and even from the non-art world of like sort of looking at this non-art in a Gaijin way. And instead of thinking about, like John Cage was talking about, music being organized sound. And I feel like art is like organized stuff, it's like, and I get a lot of times just seeing these weird, like conglomerations of pipes, or seeing, I live in an artist building that's like in a warehouse type situation, and across the street there used to be a linen factory, and they had this kind of conveyor belt that would go around, and they hang these big, they look like body bags of laundry, and it would go click 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 around this conveyor belt and into the building where they would be unloaded. And just that, hearing that sound every day, and seeing this strange process, that to me was like something that made me want to like make something in performance or sound or something that would echo that. There's the sound that the freight elevator makes in my building has wound up in more than one of my pieces. So I don't know, it's the influences are really broad. And I think visual art and the sort of visual art world where these people who, some of them are doing sound art, or they're doing video art or film, or other things, or maybe performative things, but things that sort of live in the fine arts and gallery world, have a really strong impact on me. And as a matter of fact, I always tell people that whenever I get to a new town, everybody else wants to say, oh, where's the, whatever the thing of that, whatever the tourist site is that town is famous for. They want to, the first thing I want to know is, where's your contemporary? I always want to go to the Contemporary Museum. That's what I like, make my way there in every town that I visit, because I just am so moved by seeing other people's art. And I think it's interesting. It's like the idea of influences is interesting to me too, because I think when people think about somebody being influenced, I think that there's a assumption that you're somehow imitative of whoever that is that influenced you. But I think that it's not in art, it's not really that. It's not about trying to make another one of what that other person made. It's about being so excited by the essence of what they've made that you want to make something that has that same kind of power. And it's probably going to approach it with completely different materials, completely different, methods, but something about it excites me. When I go and see work, when I went and saw William Kentridge's, these installations he does where there's film surrounding you, and all of these animations that he's done where he's like drawing, and it's filmed, his drawing is filmed, and it's over the top of like newspaper and animated, and an actual video of people, and just seeing how just incredibly beautiful and rich that world is. It just made me feel like I need to make work like that, so that I guess that's what I have to say about influences.
That's totally what I meant by the question. I maybe rephrase like what inspires you, but that's exactly what I'm looking for. Like what really, inspires you essentially.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Great. Thanks so much for chatting with us, Pamela.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.